I did an entire 22-minute long recording before I realized that said recording had no sound. Enjoy me being even more upset. Look, I'm not a picky guy. There are a lot of different aesthetics that I can easily get behind. Knights? Absolutely. Love me some swords, duels, chivalry, and mead drinking. Celtic-inspired Northlands? Again, sign me up. My Viking blood craves the presence of a people as tough as the soil they fill to farm, blue-accented armor, and mead drinking. Put the two together and mix in some Gothic and Welsh imagery, and you're bound to create something I'm a big fan of. But for the love of all that is Rhea, does the Kingdom of Faerghus suck to live in? What? Did you think this was a video about why the kingdom as a faction or route sucks? Too bad. I like the Blue Lions, and Dimitri, and I consider Azure Moon the most tightly written route in houses. Don't ask me how I feel about Azure Gleam. But I will never tolerate the frostbitten crap sack they call the country. Historically poor infrastructure, outmoded social practices even by feudal standards, a heavy reliance upon either the fanatical Western Church or the Central Church, and being surrounded by harsh landscape and even harsher neighbors in Srang and Dusker. Not Albanea, though. We've got no idea what they're doing. Sure, they started to be friends with Dusker, but look how well that turned out. Half the nobles in their country, if you can even call it that, wouldn't even be their family's heir if it wasn't for them having the genetic equivalent of pretty privilege that is a crest. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You really want to see how poorly conceived this land of feudalism and famine is? Let's look back at when it was first settled. Long before Rhea, Theros, made Fodlan what can easily be called uber-feudalism, the lands that would become Faerghus were ruled by Nemesis and his frat house of dragon blood drinkers. We all know how that ended. Besides hunting down every 10 elite, the Church and Empire gave a pass to each elite's clan if they would surrender peacefully. And when these are the folks that had dragon turtles on their side and their god-slaying king is dead, I think you can guess what most of them chose to do. The newly minted clans of the 10 elites, along with the families from the south who were gifted crests by the 4 saints, became the nobility of the continent. It's unclear if the descendants of the elites were nobles from the get-go, or they only became nobles when the Kingdom of Faerghus actually came to be, but either way it happened. Things were pretty chill for the next 700 years. Dagda and Bridget invade Fodlan and get invaded in return a couple of times, but other than that, it's so peaceful that nothing of note is recorded for centuries. Until 747, when the Northmen, led by Lugh, descendant of Bladed, up and started a rebellion alongside Kaifon, descendant of Fraldarius, and Pan, who was almost certainly Lugh's arms dealer from the synthwave Illuminati. You can pretend it's not true, but if we want to discard everything the Abyss Library says, then we have to pretend that, no, the Church is not suppressing the existence of oil and telescopes. And hey, I'll accept a win for the Dragon Pope. Are you going to hand it to me? With the relics of the 10 elites, men and weapons from Pan, and the Church apparently just watching the whole thing, the new Faerghus rebellion successfully gave the Empire the workaround. 2 major battles at Gronder Field and the Tailtean Plains, along with the Church's approval, gave them the legitimacy they needed for the Empire to back off and let the barbarians have the icy stretch of land they eventually called Faerghus. Now, there does exist the question as to whether the Church had some sort of scheme going on to intentionally split the kingdom, but I have my doubts as to that, since the kingdom was, whether it knew it or not, deeply intertwined with Pan and the Body Snatchers. Something tells me they wouldn't take kindly to any sort of negotiations with the Dragon Pope. Either way, the kingdom came into being. Leicester had its own rebellion that the Empire couldn't put down, and the kingdom took the free real estate when it saw it. Of course, within the century, Leicester would be its own country again because some moron king thought that splitting the country between his sons was a recipe for stability. If you're a ruler and ever have that idea, stab yourself. Fast forward several centuries and Faerghus once again shows why living here is a pain, when a horrific plague sweeps through the kingdom and decreases the surplus population, along with the queen consort, only being saved when Cornelia showed up. Too bad she was almost immediately replaced by a body snatcher, as stated before. Only this one, like all of them, has the acting skills of a 6-year-old being contracted by their parents into the local theater production of Seussical. Besides that, however, nothing of importance really happened in Faerghus. Oh, right, the king died. As one would expect, an event like this warrants a rebellion or two, which doesn't get very far. However, by the end, Dimitri has probably developed a mental condition or two. Specifically, the inability to eat anything and the tendency to actually see his dead loved ones shouting at him from beyond the grave. Unfortunately, therapy wasn't invented yet, so Dimitri follows the tried and true method of emotional and traumatic repression, and keeps doing that all the way up to
Is this some kind of twisted joke?
Yeah, that. And from there, Dmitri descends into some real rat-like behavior, and the rest of the kingdom just went along with it. See, the kingdom has a very rooted tradition surrounding knights, chivalry, and the social hierarchy. The knights obey their lord obeys the king, and the king attempts to not get his head cut off by whatever lord or knight isn't following the aforementioned social hierarchy. Variable effect. These traditions are frequently mentioned as a problem in Faerghusian kingdom society. Honor and chivalry are a pretty big deal to them, to such a degree that people will vanish off the face of the earth in journeys of penance for breaking said codes in a search for their honor. However, Zuko they are not, and the only scarring Gilbert gets is emotional. Upward mobility is kind of hard to do without directly having the king's favor, or you're some lucky peasant that gets adopted by a lord or made a vassal like with Dedu and Dmitri. Both of those things rely on the generosity of another person, and stops being viable when said person stops being generous. The last time the king tried to do anything about it, Dmitri got PTSD. Not to mention the frequent rebellions and almost cartoonish levels of betrayal rampant in the western half of the kingdom. It takes barely any convincing on the Empire's part to get Count Rowe and the rest of the western nobles to betray their whole country and become the Empire's vassals. All Cornelia had to do was suggest that Dmitri killed his uncle, and everyone was clamoring to side with her. Putting aside that nobody liked Rufus, not even Rufus, the fact Cornelia got away with this whole thing so easily really tells you something about the level of quality we're dealing with in these nobles. Sure, you've got guys like Rodrigue, but even they aren't immune from the national stupidity crisis. Azure Moon demonstrates the lawful stupid levels of enabling that everyone not named Felix experiences while following Dimitri's homicidal adventure. No one's hands are clean out of the main lords, but at least Edelgard and Claude bother washing the blood out of their clothes before telling their army who they're stabbing next. And it takes Rodrigue taking one for the team for Dmitri to start some introspection, and for Byleth to actually do the job of emotionally supporting him. I maintain that the one grand flaw with Azure Moon is how quickly this turnaround happens. And at this point, Felix deserves a crown of his own, saying I was right the whole time to lord over the rest of the Blue Lions for being the only one to say that maybe Dmitri needed more therapy beyond he'll get over it. Where was I? Oh right, society. Compounded to the previous issues is the kingdom's hyper-reliance on crests. For better or worse, the kingdom needs them far more actively than the Empire or Alliance. Sporting the most heroes relics out of any of the nations compared to the Alliance's 3 and the Empire's 0. Eimer and Blutgang don't count. With Sreng to the north, Dusker to the slightly more west-north, and the frequent rebellion problems I mentioned before, the kingdom heavily relies on the heroes' relics to keep their borders and their country safe. It's why trying to broadly apply Edelgard's ideas to the kingdom without some kind of replacement would be disastrous. Crests are a cornerstone to the kingdom's defense, which leads to the rigid social hierarchy that was also mentioned. Those with crests will always be favored over those who don't. Just look at the stories of Miklon, Rufus, Mercedes, and Ingrid. The fact that they do or don't have crests mean they either get passed over by their birthright, or become political and societal currency. There's similar problems in the Empire, but the kingdom takes it to a whole different level, where it's no longer just about social clout, but actual national interests. And who else is here to make it worse but the Church of Seiros? In 2 different flavors now. The Western Church for being straight-up terrorists, and the Central Church for being the Catholic Church with dragons and robots. The Church of Seiros is the state religion of the kingdom, and both are fairly intertwined with the other. When the kingdom was left leaderless and in chaos after the tragedy, the Church took over, meting out justice on perceived traitors. Whether those quote-unquote traitors were just enemies to the Central Church that the Church used the tragedy as a cover for is another question, and is no doubt baseless slander leveled at the benevolent Archbishop by some no-good Western Church dog. Speaking of, the Western Church is somehow even worse, goading lords into open rebellion against the Central Church, occupying Holy Land and attacking anyone who has an issue with it, plotting multiple assassination attempts, breaking into Garreg Mach and trying to steal priceless artifacts. Honestly, for as shady as it is, I can't even blame the Central Church for wanting these guys gone as soon as possible. Also, they are stupidly easy to manipulate. The underground dubstep clubbers manipulate them in both houses and hopes into picking a fight with the kingdom and the church, which I can't even begin to describe how much of a bad idea that is. So when all is said and done, the real relationship that matters here is the Central Church and the kingdom. which becomes a problem when Edelgard does what Edelgard does and commits to a violent revolution. In Three Houses, Dmitri was in no position to deny aiding the Central Church, since A, he had a lot of pent-up aggression towards Edelgard he wanted to get out, and B, he and many high-ranking members of the kingdom nobility were actually at the monastery when the Empire attacked, and obviously you can't just let that slide. Of course, the church went into freefall in all routes except Crimson Flower since Rhea vanishes, which in turn lets Cornelia's whole plan work in the first place. The kingdom from then on puts up an impressive resistance with only a third of its territory left. But when Dmitri pops up and decides that a suicide mission straight into the Empire is the superior plan, that resistance collapses pretty quick. In Azure he pulls back in time to fix the problem. No doubt aided by the fact that the kingdom unequivocally wins the battle at Gronder and his army didn't get totally demolished. But in Verdant Wind and Silver Snow, things don't go as well. Both times he dies off screen, and no, I don't think the weird dream sequence suggests he's actually alive. He's dead. Dead as half these kids' parents. And in Crimson Flower, the church just outright moves into Ferdiad and stays there. This stabilizes Dimitri's rule and prevents any backstabbing from Cornelia, but Rey's not exactly a healthy influence, since she's experiencing the same clownish levels of evil syndrome that Dmitri regularly goes through. Even disregarding any of that, Three Hopes points out that even if Dmitri wanted to say no to the church and leave the kingdom out of the war, not only does Edelgard actively seek to reunify the entire continent under the Empire, but the average people of Faerghus are so devoted to the church that saying no would risk outright rebellion. It isn't until Golden Wildfire's second act that Dmitri considers that the kingdom could continue if they centered around the Western Church instead. While I appreciate the forward thinking on Dimitri's part, anything involving the Western Church sounds like a mistake. And you want to know the best part? At any point, Faerghus has to deal with attacks from possibly 4 different sides. In Scarlet Blaze and Golden Wildfire, Faerghus has both the Empire and Leicester bearing down on it. Meanwhile, Srang could choose to attack whenever they please, and Duscur has been in active revolt for years now. The church's insular traditions don't help in that regard either. But Faerghus was shown to be making strides in spite of that, although when Lambert actually tried to do something, it resulted in, well. And of course, that just puts Rufus in charge, while the Western nobles are one excuse away from betraying the whole kingdom because they feel like it. Further solidifying my belief that the only good things that ever came out of Western Faerghus were Ash and Yuri. But what if Faerghus is in charge of all Fodlan, you may ask? What if they win the war and expand beyond the cold, nasty place they call home? Well, that probably fixes some of the resource problems, but the societal ones are sticking for a while. Dmitri will inevitably create a system of governance that lets the people have more of a say. Although the exacts of said government is unknown and the phrasing based on his epilogue slide is vague. Despite that, Dmitri will die relatively young, probably from overwork, and the status quo for nobles and crests in general doesn't really change, and the church will be back in power, with Byleth in charge, so maybe it will be better than last time, but the prevailing problem is that we just don't know. Let's not forget the Shadow People. Happy's ending makes sure we know the cult of Daft Punk is dead, but I also put forward that we needed a DLC character ending to even know that. I can only imagine that some kind of resurgence will happen, but I guess that is flying a bit too close to speculation. And that's just in Houses. In hopes the kingdom is getting screwed from every angle. Granted, in Golden Wildfire, Claude pulls the switcheroo on Edelgard and tries to make her end the war by taking out the church, but in Azure Gleam, Claude is also going to probably start a new war to get rid of said church after the Empire is defeated. Either way, the kingdom is just getting dragged around in hopes, and even the church's support in Azure Gleam can only hold up this mess of a state for so long. In the end, Faerghus sucks to live in. But I like the Crazy Blue Man Group's story, and Atrocity will never not be the funniest name for a combat art, so I guess it balances out. Thank you for watching and listening to my mad rambling about a fictional country that by its very nature makes me angry to think about living in. Truly, your dedication is appreciated. As always, like, comment, subscribe, you know. Tell me what you enjoyed or tell me that I'm a total lunatic. Either way, I appreciate it. See you all next time around the hearth, folks. You want to know the really most infuriating part about Faerghus? It's that it's supposed to be based on France, with a number of character names being drawn from French literature or art. Excuse me, but you can't name a place Faerghus, set it in the north, and give names to characters like Dimitri and Ingrid and tell me that it's based on France. Could have been worse, I suppose. They could have named the whole country something stupid like Leicester.